Hello everyone, good afternoon, welcome to this new lecture in our program on the modern novel. My name is Faisal and I'm your instructor today. Our lecture is lecture number 7 and we're looking at the symbols in the novel Lord of the Flies. So let's talk first about the genre. What genre is Lord of the Flies? Well, first of all, it is an allegorical fiction. Lord of the Flies is an allegorical novel that employs the realistic situation of a group of boys stranded on a deserted island to embody abstract ideas about human beings' inherent savagery and dangers of mob mentality and totalitarian leadership. In other words, Lord of the Flies combines fantasy with realism. So it's a situation where a group of boys are stranded on a deserted island, and from this situation, boys on a deserted island, the novel tries to convey an idea about human beings. And this idea about human beings, that basically human beings have an inherent savagery, right? That there is instinctual drive in human beings towards savagery. And also the novel wants to warn us about the dangers of mob mentality and totalitarian leadership. Allegorical fiction employs specific images, characters, and settings to represent intangible emotions or ideas, such as a character named the Lover personifying the concept of romantic love. In Lord of the Flies, Golding creates a backdrop of global war for a narrative about boys attempting to build a civil society following the presumed destruction of civilization. So in the background, there is a global war, there is a world war going on. That's in the background of the story. And then with this background of a global war, we have the story of, boys, children, attempting to build, to reconstruct a civil society on a deserted island, following the presumed, because of the war, they presume that like society, civilization has collapsed and they're back to start from scratch. How do they survive? How do they organize themselves? How do they live in peace with each other? How do they judge when they have situations that need refereeing or that needs judging, or who gets to lead? Should they have a leader? All these are questions that the story puts on the table. There is a global war in the background, and there is these little children on a deserted island with no one to help, and they have to start from scratch to try and build a civilization. Will they succeed? Will they lapse and give in to their savage instincts? That's what the story wants to explore. Characters represent different negative and positive aspects of humanity. So, in a way, these boys on this deserted island are us. They represent us, humanity. And the characters represent different aspects of humanity. Some of them represent negative aspects of humanity, others represent positive aspects of humanity. Piggy, for example, who stands for reason and intellect, and Jack, who stands for violence, cruelty, and totalitarianism. Objects on the island serve allegorical functions as well. Most significantly, the conch, which represents communication and the democratic process, because remember, the conch is used to gather the boys around, and once they're gathered, permission to speak demands that you hold the conch in your hand. So the conch represents communication and the democratic process. Allegorical fiction is a genre that asks readers to question the concepts governing human interaction, and explores the way larger forces impact individual lives. In telling the story of an isolated group of young boys attempting to remake society, rebuild it, actors represent different negative and positive aspects of humanity. Piggy, for example, we said, stands for reason and intellect. Jack stands for violence, cruelty, and totalitarianism. Objects on the island also serve allegorical functions. Most significantly, the conch, for example, the conch shell represents communication and the democratic process. Allegorical fiction, as a genre, what it does, it asks you, the reader, to question the governing concepts or the concepts governing human interaction, right? So you question the concepts that govern how humans live together and explore the way larger forces impact individual lives. Like, for example, here in the story we have a global war and how this global war impacts the lives of individuals. If it wasn't for this global war, these boys would not have boarded that plane, and that plane would not have fallen down. And these kids, these children, would not be stuck on a deserted island, and they would not be forced to try to start and organize a society from scratch, right? The book asks whether the breakdown of civilization into war is inevitable. Is it inevitable? Which means hatmiya, right? Is it inevitable that civilization will collapse into war, will break down into war? Is that something that's inevitable for human beings? Is this where we're going as a human race? And also the novel wants us readers to ask, what forces within us drive us towards self-destruction? There are forces within us as human beings that drive us towards self-destruction. What are they? Do we know them? Do we know how to control them? I think this is what the novel in the end is trying to get us, the readers, to do, is to think about these questions. Lord of the Flies deviates from the genre of allegorical fiction in that the main characters are fully developed. They are conflicted and believable boys. So here we have a change. Lord of the Flies is not a typical allegorical story, because usually in typical allegorical stories the characters are not fully developed. They are just a symbol that stand for something in reality. But here what is new is that this allegorical fiction, Lord of the Flies, present to us main characters that are fully developed, fully conflicted, and believable as characters, as boys. In traditional allegory, characters are often representatives of a single attribute. So they could represent the good or the bad or evil, and the work can feel bombastic in the author's insistence on the main idea. Most of the characters in Lord of the Flies, in contrast, have a degree of ambivalence and are presented as initially sympathetic, right? Most of them, we begin by sympathizing with them. Ralph, who symbolizes fair, progress-minded leadership, is also afflicted by self-doubt and an inability to articulate his thoughts, or even think clearly at crucial moments. Even Jack, rather than being a symbol of pure evil or mindless violence, he's not. He's not presented as like a symbol of pure evil and mindless violence. That's what he becomes through the course of the events. But Jack also experiences moments of weakness, like when the boys vote to keep Ralph chief. Jack is presented sympathetically in the beginning of the novel and grows increasingly aggressive as he is corrupted by the violence he enacts on the pigs and the other boys. Rather than remaining static, one-dimensional stand-ins for ideas, this is what traditional allegorical stories do. They give us static characters, they are one-dimensional, and all they do is stand in for ideas. Well, here the characters of Lord of the Flies are different. They're not static, they're not one-dimensional, and their job is not to just be a symbol for some ideas. The characters in Lord of the Flies change over the course of the novel, making it different than classic works of allegorical fiction. Also about genre, Lord of the Flies is a dystopian fiction. And because Lord of the Flies presents the characters as living in a nightmarish, oppressive society as a result of their inherently flawed nature, it is also an example of dystopian fiction. And dystopia, to put it like simply, is a narrative that predicts a gloomy future, a hopeless future, that predicts the future of humanity to be scary and nightmarish and hopeless, basically. In direct contrast to utopian fiction, which posits that human beings are perfectible and a society free of suffering is possible, utopian narratives predict a hopeful future and predict human beings to be capable of perfecting themselves and society of improving itself. Dystopian fiction doesn't. Dystopian fiction predicts a hopeless, disastrous, nightmarish future. Lord of the Flies is a dystopian fiction, right? The genre became popular during the 20th century, this is dystopia, when works like George Orwell's Animal Farm and 1984 presented futuristic worlds beset by tyranny, violence, and suppressed speech. There's no free speech, there's violence, and there's tyranny. That's what the novels of George Orwell, Animal Farm, and 1984 predict the future to be. They predict the future to be a life under tyranny, violence, and suppressed speech. It is an especially popular genre for contemporary young adult novels like The Hunger Games. Although the setting of Lord of the Flies initially appears an Edenic utopia, I mean, in the beginning you have, a group of smart boys on a beautiful island. It's like a little heaven with abundant fruit, fresh water, and beautiful beaches. It quickly devolves into a dystopian landscape where the boys are hungry, dirty, fearful of the unnamed beast, and tyrannized by an increasingly sadistic leader who is Jack. Dystopian writers employ fear, suspense, and often violence. And why do they do that? Well, the point is to warn readers about the dangers of totalitarianism. The message of their novels is that societies can never be truly perfect, but can get better if individuals work together in a democratic process. Ralph, in Lord of the Flies, represents this potential and this hope. In his insistence on free speech, He insists on voting, and he insists on collaborative labor to provide shelter, gather food, and tend the fire. Let's talk a little bit about style. Lord of the Flies mixes lyrical descriptions of nature with vivid action scenes and extended passages of dialogue. This is what, in terms of style, these three characteristics stand out. Lord of the Flies mixes these three characteristics. Lyrical descriptions of nature, because it's a beautiful deserted island with beautiful beaches and fruits and fresh water and everything. So there is lyrical, beautiful, poetic descriptions of nature. Then there is vivid action scenes and extended passages of dialogue. This style mirrors the boys' descent into violence and chaos. The book opens with a description of the island in the aftermath of the plane crash that maroons the boys. Like, for example, the novel says, all around him the long scar smashed into the jungle was a bath of heat. A bird, a vision of red and yellow, flashed upward with a witch-like cry, right? This is almost a poetic passage, but it also describes this descent into violence and chaos. Golding uses metaphor and generic words like boy, bird, and jungle to create a sense of dislocation in the reader. Where are we, right? Because Ralph ceases to be Ralph and he becomes a boy, a bird, a jungle, and it creates a sense of dislocation in the reader. Where are we? Who is the boy? What is the scar and what causes it? These stylistic choices that the author makes align the reader with the boys who might be asking similar questions. We feel like we're in the boys' shoes, who might be asking similar questions at this point in the narrative. The comparison of a plane crash to a scar and a bird to a witch create an ominous sense that despite the beauty of the natural setting, the island is threatening as well. And the boys' experience on the island will scar them. Golding presents events in a fairly detached, straightforward style. It's like he's just describing things without emotions. So he presents the events in a fairly detached, straightforward style, enhancing the character's role as symbols as well as individuals. The reader is prevented from being identified with any one character too closely. When one of the little ones has a nightmare, the wail rose remote and unearthly and turned to an inarticulate gibbering. This is what the story tells us when one of the little ones has a nightmare. The story says, the wail rose remote and unearthly and turned to an inarticulate gibbering. By removing the humanity and intelligibility from the boy's cries, Golding creates a distance from the boy's suffering. So here's this little boy who has a nightmare and he starts screaming. But his screams turn into a wail, you know, a wail, like when somebody is dead and people are wailing. So the wail rose, this little boy's scream because of a nightmare, you know, usually they are, you know, tender and we rush to like comfort them. But here, this little boy, his screams quickly turn into wails. And the wail rose, remote and unearthly. It's like it's not from the earth at all. And turned to an inarticulate gibbering. By removing the humanity and the intelligibility from the boy's cries, he's neither human nor intelligible. Golding creates a distance from the boy's suffering. Golding uses more intimate, evocative language to make the island itself a personification of the evil in the boys, as when the trees, quote, rubbed each other with an evil speaking. That's like the trees. When the trees rubbed each other with an evil speaking. Or in this passage when he says, revolving masses of gas piled up the static until the air was ready to explode. Even the air that pushed in from the sea was hot and held no refreshment. So even the air coming from the sea was hot and provided no refreshment. So even nature is turning against them. And so just to recap, we look today at the genre of Lord of the Flies. First of all, we say that it is an allegorical fiction and that it is a dystopia. And we talked a little bit about the style, and we saw how Lord of the Flies mixes lyrical description of nature with vivid action scenes and extended passages of dialogue. And we described a little bit how Golding manipulates these stylistic features to get his point across to us as readers. Thank you for coming. I hope this lecture has been useful and entertaining, and I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.